All right, let's hope the computer doesn't crash this time around. This is the Inheritance of Europe podcast. I am your host, Patrick Richardson. Now, for this week, we're going to cover the years 1939 to 1948. We wanted to do World War II, but we also thought we should spread it out to almost a decade. So this doesn't mean that World War II doesn't matter. World War II is probably the most defining event in our own lives, even though we haven't directly experienced it. World War II is the biggest human civilization defining event that in the 20th century, and probably even still into the 21st century. There are so many social factors that come into play that I don't even think we should talk about them too much. We're mostly going to talk about military campaigns, popular politicians, popular social programs run by governments, but we're not going to talk so much about cultural arts or popular movements that had existed on the fringes of society. Today, we're going to talk about the combat, the lives lost, and the meaning behind all of it. World War II, the Inheritance of Europe podcast. Evan Loganov is my esteemed guest. Evan, take it away.
Okay, so last podcast we got to the invasion of Poland, and that was basically what the consensus is, at least in Europe, was the beginning of World War II. If you go to Japan, I mean, most people say the invasion of China would be the start of it there, but in Europe, the invasion of Poland was there. That's when the Western powers, mostly of France and the UK, declared war on Germany and promised to defend Poland. But the truth is they actually didn't defend Poland at all. British troops they gathered all in France, and they kind of left Poland to their fate, really. I mean, the Germans invaded. To call it like an unfair battle would be basically like it would be an understatement.
Yeah, and there was, of course, the very unfair. They didn't really care about Poland. They kind of just were aware that the Low Countries would be invaded by the German Wehrmacht. And so they figured that they could ally with the Belgians and the Dutch and the Luxembourgians, but they didn't actually really have a way to fight for the Polish on the Eastern Front. Now, keep in mind, the Russians didn't want Poland to be invaded, the Soviets, right? But they actually were fine taking land from Poland if Hitler allowed it. And with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that's exactly what happened. So the Russians aren't even involved in the war yet because they've just received all this free land thanks to Hitler. So
well, yeah, they invaded Poland too, and like a few weeks after Germany, I think like a month. But overall, the Polish government fled to Romania. That's where they conducted their business, basically, because they had no land left. I mean, and the French actually did the first offensive in Germany. They invaded the Saar lands, which were originally theirs, were just, according to the Versailles Treaty, they're kind of like an industrial sort of coal mining region. But most of all on the Western Front, they call it the phony war, actually, the first 6 months or so of World War II, because nothing really happened on the Western Front.
Yeah, you're right. There's a guy called the Marshal Weyland who took over from Gamelin, and Gamelin had a very good idea of how to. It was called the Dials Plan, something like that, something with a D, ended with S. It was a plan constructed by Gamelin to defend against German invasion on the Maginot Line, which is basically the border between Germany and France at this time. Now, they didn't think that the Germans would attack in the southern part of this line, so they didn't fortify it as well. But in the years preceding the war, they fortified the borderlands really heavily with like state-of-the-art like bunkers and garrisons for troops and all these turrets that were like, batteries, basically, just like really involved fortifications. But they didn't expect that the Germans would just invade south of in the Ardennes forest, which over the Vosges River, which is because they thought it was too hilly, too forested. They didn't think the Germans would actually invade there. They thought the Germans would do a plan like they did in World War I, which is invade through the Netherlands. And the Germans, they started to do that but but it was actually Franz Halder's idea was that they should just do the World War I all over again. But there were several people who in the German high command that disagreed, and eventually they went in through the Ardennes forest, kind of snuck in. The major reserve component that was supposed to support the French army at the Ardennes border, it was actually being sent up north to Belgium or Netherlands or the Low Countries. So it wasn't, they completely blundered their defense of France, and the line was penetrated, even though it was an extremely well-defended line.
The Allies,
and they call it the phony war because the French, after this point, the French couldn't really do anything to prevent the German invasion. And so they sort of had this half-assed effort. When Wayland took over from Gamelin, remember these are the French field marshals, Wayland decided to just, his first order of the day would just be have a good night's sleep. And then over the next week, he literally just went to Paris on courtesy visits. So he didn't even care to jump on board and start trying to figure out how to keep the line together. They didn't know what the Nazis were doing. They just knew that they were taking over, the Czech Republic, Austria, the Rhinelands, the Saar region, all that. But they didn't know that they were doing barbaric medical experiments yet. The reputation the Nazis had was not so bad that the French thought that they were someone that had to be stopped at all costs. They thought this was going to be a repeat of World War I, essentially. A war of pride, essentially.
Well, yeah, and another thing about the Allies being cut off guard is most of their troops were in Flanders, which was northern Belgium, and when they invaded through the Ardennes, they were kind of cut off between them and the actual Germany. So basically, they had to totally recalibrate. And eventually, the British and a lot of the French would evacuate Dunkirk, which was famous because it was not basically civilian boats were coming in rescuing the soldiers, and it was considered really embarrassing for the Allies.
Operation Dynamo, one of many evacuation operations that happened after the fall of France. And then eventually the British, the Germans would take over France and install a government called the Vichy government that was Nazi affiliated, and it was run by World War I war heroes for
Pétain,
Philippe Pétain, and he was always seen with suspicion because of this in the aftermath of the war.
Well, one of the reasons that they said the French at least capitulated so quickly in at least the eastern part of France with Paris was because they didn't want Paris to be damaged by what the Nazis could do in a siege. They considered Paris like the crown jewel of their society, their culture, their infrastructure. And the idea of having a siege, which they ultimately thought they couldn't win, was just too big. So they just decided to surrender that area and relocate to Western France under the Vichy regime. I mean, Pétain was considered a national hero because of World War I, but after that, he was pretty much disgraced. They actually said after the war, the only reason they didn't execute him was he was in his 90s by then. The only reason they didn't execute him was because of his role in World War I. They imprisoned him for the short rest of his life.
He had that much prestige that they refused to execute him. It's crazy.
Well, yeah, and let's get back into some of the
and the other thing is that as you were saying, the evacuations were really involved, and they had not just evacuations out of Dunkirk, but they had evacuations out of Brittany and even in southern and southwestern France. So the British army after these evacuations couldn't invade anymore. They just had to supply air support, and they had to. They would send in what were called commandos, which were essentially guerrilla fighters that would help sort of destabilize Vichy France. And they worked with the French resistance to destabilize Vichy France and free them from Nazi control. But it was sort of not a real, no real battles were taking place, at least not the scale of the Bulge or of Normandy or whatever.
Yeah, let's get on.
One thing that's important to note is that the leader in the invasion on the German side was a very capable tank commander by the name of Hans Guderian. Hans Guderian actually wrote books on, or eventually was famous for his books on tank doctrine, and he was one of the most respected commanders on the German side, and there were many, but he was, and still is, one of the most respected commanders there. The reason it's worth mentioning is because tank warfare didn't really exist in World War I the way it did in World War II. There was a lot of speculation in the interwar period about how it might change in the years to come, but there was no real experience on the matter. This guy basically proved that through Blitzkrieg tactics, which is essentially charging one tank forward with along in a column, and then having other tanks follow in support as the first column sort of retreats and then circles back. That those Blitzkrieg tactics were defined by Guderian in this campaign, the Battle of France. And so that would sort of set the pace for all the infantry and tank ground warfare for the rest of the war, and even until the modern day.
Yeah, I'll get into some of the things that happened on the Eastern Front. So there were some earlier actions on the Eastern Front, mostly involving Soviet invasions. First of all, they annexed the Balkan states, who were pretty defenseless then. I mean, they kind of pretty much had to capitulate. And they also invaded Finland. Now, Finland actually did fight back, and they actually were very effective. It was called the Winter War. They were engaged in like kind of guerrilla tactics against the Soviet forces, and they actually inflicted much larger casualties on the Soviet forces than they took casualties themselves. But ultimately, they capitulated and agreed that they gave up some of their territory just to avoid a long war, because they know in the long run they couldn't, they wouldn't win basically a war with the Soviet Union, especially when summer came, because winter was the kind of advantage. They knew the turf and it was harder to navigate, but for them. But ultimately, they gave up only 9% of their territory in the Moscow Peace Treaty, which they actually said that they gave up more of their territory than the Russians actually controlled, during the war from their invasion. But so a lot of them say it was unfair, but it was ultimately what needed to be done, and it was the only way to keep its independence in the long run. There's
a famous sniper who was on the Finnish side who took out hundreds. He was like a lone gunman in the middle of a frozen lake or a pond, really, and he took out hundreds and hundreds of Russian troops that were trying to kill just him, basically. I'm not even sure he was defending anything of importance. Even he just was impossible to kill. And the defensive capabilities of the ground troops in the Winter War is sort of like this incredible badge of honor for Finland. And remember, Finland wasn't even a country, or at least a sovereign nation, until World War I ended, and the Russians were forced to liberate what are now the Baltic countries. So it had only been a country for 20 years. And yet they had so much, and they had this incredible ability to defend themselves from their former imperial overlord.
Well, yeah, and also the Nazis invaded Denmark and Norway and basically took them over. They did not invade Sweden. They also didn't invade Switzerland, both because that is a very mountainous territory that's worth more than much to take, and it's a neutral territory, and they had a lot of stuff in Swiss banks, and they feared it'll be liquidated possibly if they tried to invade. That's another thing that isn't mentioned.
Yeah, there are several neutral countries. Ireland was too far away. Yeah, I think Sweden is a little bit similar to Ireland. It's just kind of isolated. They didn't have a lot of power, so they just kind of were able to stay neutral. And obviously Norway is conquered, and Denmark capitulated.
This isn't actually known a lot, but Iceland was subject to the Danish crown. So basically, the British actually just took over Iceland before before Denmark was invaded, because they didn't want them to control anything that would be the Nazis control something that would be above them. Yeah.
So the British secured Iceland. Wow.
And it was basically a bloodless battle. No one was killed at all, but that's not really known. It's not really that strategically important, but it's just something. So basically, with the French, so you want to get more into the French? And let's get
the resistance movement bubbled up shortly after the Vichy government was installed by the Nazis, and a figure rose to prominence. His name was Charles de Gaulle, and he became kind of known for his famous radio briefings that he'd give to the people that were being persecuted in France, if they had the technology to listen in on to him. And the French didn't kind of became irrelevant for a while as a war party, but uh but the the Americans did something interesting, whereas they came and started fighting. They started teaming up with the British to fight in Africa, right, against the Italians and the Germans. And that's where the General George Patton, emerged. And of course, you have Erwin Rommel, who showed up as the tank commander there. And they're famous for duking it out in Africa and they're fighting in Egypt and places, sort of Libya,
Yeah, the African campaign had multiple purposes. First of all, Germany only got involved largely to aid Italy and for the idea that it might give them a southern theater to invade the Soviet Union, because Italy wanted to recreate kind of the ancient Roman Empire in North Africa. That's one of the reasons they invaded. And one of the reasons, this is a little bit later in World War II, but one of the reasons the Allies agreed to go back is both it would give a staging area for the Free French government, largely in Algeria, because Algeria it actually had department status within France. It was under the Vichy regime then, but they actually gained it back for what's called the Free French forces under de Gaulle. And it could serve as their staging point. That's where de Gaulle was located after it was taken for most of the war. And also, when they wanted to test the Americans when they arrived, because they thought it would be too risky to have the Americans do an invasion in mainland France before they could be tested against the Wehrmacht forces. So they thought that as a good test, that would be a lower risk, kind of not as high stakes as invading Europe.
Yeah, and eventually they lost to the Americans, and the Americans ended up invading Sicily.
Yeah,
they took back Egypt, of course, and they invaded Sicily. I don't know. A fun fact about the Italians in Egypt is apparently every infantryman or every squad, a small fire team, had an espresso machine that they would use to help them fight. It's like, and we wonder why they didn't win the war. They're all given an espresso machine. But yeah, and then so they invade Sicily, and famously George S. Patton gets reprimanded by high command because he slaps a soldier in the med bay for being shell shocked, and then so he's treated. People started to wonder and doubt Patton at this point, even though he's the best American commander. Yeah. Keep in mind, the Americans, while they are really gung ho about this war, most of their fighting is in the Pacific. So this war is they have two fronts for themselves, kind of like the Russians, the Germans. Not the Russians, the Germans. And anyway, they eventually take over Sicily, and then they invade Salerno and Taranto, and start moving up the coast of Italy. The Germans were actually fighting the Battle of Kursk at this time against the Soviets. But once Italy was invaded, I'll let you say more of it, but I want to say is once Italy was invaded, they had to move a significant fraction of their army down south. And once they got to Italy and the Italians capitulated and Rome was taken and Mussolini was deposed, the Germans let me finish. The Germans double-crossed their Italian allies, and they were like, oh, you guys surrendered to the Americans? Hey, well, now we're going to fight you. And the Germans started fighting the Italians and chasing them around and trying to make them surrender their arms and armor and ammo. And there were instances where like thousands of Italian soldiers were like mercilessly murdered because the Germans were just so fed up with them. Well, it's really a horrific part of World War II no one talks about. Fortunately, a lot of these battalions were able to defend in the south against the Germans, but the Italians are double crossed by the Germans because they surrendered too quickly to the Americans, basically.
Yeah, with the Italians, actually, a lot of people say, oh, that Mussolini was deposed by the Allies, but that's actually not entirely true, because a lot of his a lot of his thing was actually partisans who were Italians within Italy that worked to depose him. They were actually the ones who killed Mussolini. They caught him, I think, just summarily executed him, you know.
Wasn't he deposed and then he was also murdered and like hung and shot naked?
Yeah, basically the most embarrassing death you could imagine, like most shameful kind of. The Germans
Was he,
actually,
no, but wasn't he
when
deposed by the Allies? But then he was only murdered by his own people.
yeah, but there was kind of a civil war in Italy, like after that, breaking out between the partisans and the loyalists, because the Italian
Yeah.
government under Mussolini was gone, but the Germans instituted their own government, basically puppet state, called the Italian Social Republic. That was basically their idea to keep Italy in their hands. It was a huge civil war during then.
Yeah. So a lot of communism in Italy and socialism that was sort of always kept at bay by Mussolini, but eventually the war got too difficult and they just started to rise up and seize various positions of power.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that the Mussolini was kind of like Hitler in a way, because he became really incompetent towards the end, and he started he would have like call girls and like a harem of women that he would like fuck and sleep with for like most of the day, like for hours and hours and hours. And if important like dignitaries or like commanders or officials showed up and asked for things for the government or for the army or for social, relief, he would just be like, oh, I'm busy. And so they would have to wait until like 8 o'clock at night when he was done screwing to talk to him. And even then he might just be so exhausted that he just like didn't want to talk to them at all. And so Mussolini was literally impossible to work with towards the final months of his life.
Okay, look, should we get into the Blitzkrieg? We didn't really cover that.
Well, the Blitzkrieg what I want to talk about is the Luftwaffe.
Yeah, the German Air Force.
Yeah, because
so
there's the Battle
Germany,
of Britain, where the air
even they were smart,
where London and other cities in England are bombed heavily by the German Air Force, and the German Air Force is very competent, but it ends up not being really a great match against the Allied combined forces. One group that was very good was the German Navy. In fact, when they took over Norway, it was like this like kind of miracle, because they had basically no navy of any relevance, and then they built up one, and it was really impressive. And then they could have been intercepted by the British, but they just never were, and they were able to conquer Norway like swiftly, even though the British were right there. They could have done something. They did almost nothing.
Well, yeah, the British, I mean, there's no way the German Navy would be good enough to beat the British Navy. I mean, they were like considered the masters of the sea, but the
other thing is the Royal Air Force. The Royal Air Force. Sorry, I'm just saying one more thing. The Royal Air Force was supposed to give air support to the French and the Dutch and the Belgians, but there was a point where the King Leopold of Belgium basically told the French generals, like, "Hey, like, we're tired of fighting. We can't really do it anymore, and the British aren't going to help you guys with their air support if we stop fighting. So we're all fucked, because they're only providing the air support because they know the Belgians are fighting." And remember, a lot of these battles were in Belgium. So once that failed, then the Royal Air Command, the Air Force, not the Air Command, but the Royal Air Force had to evacuate troops at Dunkirk. They couldn't really, they didn't have, even though they were air support, they needed support of their own on the ground, and they didn't have that. So all they could do was kind of defensive maneuvers, and they weren't really going to do any full-scale bombing. But they did eventually jump back once they got more Allied supports from the Americans, and the Russians got more involved. They were able to start carpet bombing basically the German cities, and one of the Hamburg was the second largest city in Germany, and it got fucking leveled almost. I mean, it was an immense firestorm there for weeks, and people were literally being turned into human torches, and hundreds, like thousands, tens of thousands of people, civilians, were killed. It was almost as, probably some people say it was worse than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. And they also say that about Dresden, which is a city near Poland in Germany, which had very nice architecture. And then even more relevant, even more salient, I think, was Cologne, which had the most heritage of any German city. And it was completely bombed out in the old town. Tens of thousands of civilian casualties, not to mention military. And the only building that was left standing was its famous cathedral, the Cologne Cathedral. But every other building surrounding it was basically leveled.
Okay, so I'll get back into the Blitz. So we talked about the German bombing getting kind of ahead there, but with the Blitz, it was mostly the industrial cities that were bombed. Coventry was not like one of the biggest cities, but it was heavily bombed because it was basically a city that's near Birmingham because it was an industrial city. There were bombings of also of Birmingham, and London was not so much bombed as an industrial city, then it was that political capital. And they thought basically if they bombed London, it would be able to demoralize the British, and make them want to sue for peace. But
Yeah, they
course,
mostly bombed
the
the ports, right? They mostly involved the industrial ports.
And Plymouth was another port that was bombed. But basically Neville Chamberlain had to resign in disgrace, and that's when Winston Churchill rose, and he basically made it very clear.
Was that literally the same time as the bombings? That transition happened?
I think it was right before, but in 1940. But they even put propaganda. The famous thing, "Keep calm and carry on." It's basically just saying, don't let what's happening affect your morale. Live like it's just not happening.
I have a funny story about the bombings in London. My friend had like a grandfather or uncle or something who was there, and he was kind of an eccentric character, and literally he would like stay on the rooftop watching the bombs hit the buildings in London. And literally his relatives were like, dude, what the fuck are you doing up here? You need to get down. And he just like wanted to stay up and keep watching.
Well, yeah.
Kind of a funny story.
So probably the next major event would be definitely the Eastern Front opening up. And this is where most of the most brutal, sort of violent, huge loss of life warfare would come from.
Okay, so course, you're going to talk mostly about this. So I wanted to set the stage a little bit. The Germans invaded earlier on in about 1940 or early in the war. They invaded Ukraine as sort of a stepping stone to Moscow, and they weren't met with a ton of resistance, but they did create a lot of casualties. There were basically this is really the beginning of like the most gruesome phase of the Holocaust. They would find people and round them up and shoot them and then create mass graves in Ukraine and the Balkans. And eventually they had to go back when they started losing the war, and they had to dig up these bodies and look and hide them because they didn't want people to know they had these mass graves. Another thing is that Ukraine was a relatively easy thing for them to fight into, and it made them overconfident for when they actually would invade Russia. And they tried to invade Russia in the Battle of Kursk, but they were distracted by the Americans invading Italy, and so they couldn't actually let the battle continue. But then, and this is basically, and then the invasion of Normandy happened, and so now they had to fight on two fronts, not just in Italy, but also in France, and eventually even in the Netherlands, and with Operation Market Guard. So yeah, but please go full speed with Russia.
Okay. Before I do with Russia, just a note on the Holocaust. So there were actually multiple phases of the Holocaust. A lot of people don't know. So early in 1941 or 1940, so what they did with most of the Jews in Germany, Poland, and the areas they took before invading the Soviet Union was they put them in ghettos, which are basically just places they were restrained to. They couldn't leave, they definitely not without authorization, they couldn't leave. And basically like they had all their rights stripped away, but they were still not exterminated. Now, what happened in the early invasion in 1941 was that Jews would just be sort of, just shot, there were no concentration camps. They'd just be shot on spot when they found them, just massacred, gunned down. But later in 1942, they devised what we now know as the final solution, which there were originally ideas like Joseph Goebbels suggested the Madagascar plan early on, which was an idea because Vichy France had said Madagascar was a French colony, and Vichy France had given it to the Germans, and they thought they would just send all the Jews that they had in the ghettos to Madagascar, where they'd just mostly just die of exposure and lack of like knowledge of the area, and they just considered that a good way to do them. But ultimately, because they considered it logistically impossible, and because they wanted something useful, that's when a lot of the concentration camp systems were devised. And those idea was we kill the ones that, can't, obviously kill the ones that were infirm, young, disabled, but any of the ones we can get work out of, we get work out of, but we do it with the intent purpose of, just doing execution through labor, basically, just like working them to death and within a certain, like maybe like a few months or 6 months or so. So that was the whole entire ideology behind the concentration camps. I mean, a lot of people know about the Holocaust, but they don't know exactly how they developed. But with the Soviet Union invasion, I'll get back to that. So the original one that was in 1941 called Operation Barbarossa, named after the ancient Holy Roman Emperor. And that was kind of like, they thought, when they saw the Winter War and how, basically bad the Soviets were against Finland, they thought they would be an easy target. And so they invaded in the Eastern Front, and they basically, until they got into Russia, they were just mowing through the Soviets. Like they were just retreating like endlessly, basically. They were actually like in Poland, they had mass execution of their political prisoners they had there, the Soviets, because they wanted to cover the retreat and not have them join the Germans. And they did a lot of scorched earth tactics, like burning farms and stuff like that. And like basically just burning the stuff behind them to make it harder for the Germans. And Stalin had very incompetently purged a lot of the more senior military members of the Soviet Union before that. So he got rid of a lot of experienced, people who could know a lot of this stuff. But so the Germans, they took both the Balkans, Eastern Poland and Ukraine, which was before that. And they actually had very different reactions to the population there. And a lot of this has to do with what the Nazis, sort of racial ideology was. So in the Balkans, they actually collaborated a lot with the Balkans. The Balkans were heavily oppressed by the Soviets, so they actually welcomed the Germans. They actually, kind of facilitated the Holocaust and deportation of Jews there. But basically, with the Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians, with the exception of Ukrainian Jews, who were obviously very scared of the German invasion, a lot of the regular Ukrainians were actually they were going to welcome the Germans. They were like viewing them as liberators from Stalinist oppression, but the Germans did, of course, not reciprocate that feeling. They were massacring, Ukrainians left and right, not just Jewish, but non-Jewish, Slavic Ukrainians. And that has to do with Nazi racial ideology, which is that they viewed Slavic people in kind of the Untermensch category, kind of around the same as Jews or other,
as opposed to the Übermensch, right?
Yeah. They viewed, and that was like, they treated the civilian populations much more brutally than they would in France or in Netherlands or any of the other places based on that racial ideology. This actually relates somewhat to my family because, my grandfather and his family are Russian, and they were born they were from the Soviet Union, but they're actually on an assignment in Ukraine at the time of the German invasion. He was an engineer working on some projects for them. And they were unluckily, right in the line of the German, basically the German army, and they were captured. And if not for the fact he was an engineer and could provide them some useful things, he might have just been summarily executed because they sent him to a forced labor camp. And that's how they did a lot of their, sort of building up their army and stuff like that while their soldiers were gone to war. They used a lot of captured forced labor, but generally only to certain people they thought could be useful. Anyone else they just killed mostly. So, and
keep in mind that that while this is happening or percolating into form, the Western Front doesn't really exist, but it's going to ferment with the Allied invasions of Normandy, Utah, Omaha Beach. And then eventually, it culminates with Operation Neptune, where they take Normandy from the Germans, kind of a reckless mission. And then eventually they start going into on the Western Front, right? They end up going into the Netherlands, and then they end up fighting in Bastogne, where they get a very, very stiff resistance from the Germans. It's basically a bloodbath. A lot of artillery firing, a lot of air support on both sides, gruesome fighting in northern France, and this is at the same time, as the Eastern fighting is going on.
The Eastern Front was a lot like what's known as like the Siege of Leningrad, which is what's today St. Petersburg. It was renamed Leningrad with the Soviets, but they basically engaged in a siege that the whole purpose was just to completely starve the city, just kill the entire population by that. And like it's estimated like around 1 million, did starve to death of the population. Like there were like stories about how brutal it was, both from the bombing and mostly just from the starvation. But 1942 was kind of one of the pivotal years. Like it was called the Summer Campaign. So basically the Nazis, obviously Russia is a huge amount of land, and tanks and all the other things require oil to operate. And they were running out of oil. They couldn't get enough from Germany. So in the southern USSR, around the Caucasus area, there are oil fields, basically. It's really known as a rich oil area. They didn't try to take Moscow for that reason, largely, was because they thought the fuel would be out. So they decided to go south to those places. And their army actually split off into two, because Stalingrad is on, I think it's one of the rivers. I forget. It's not called Volgograd, but that's on the Volga.
Is it the Volga?
River. Yeah. But they split one to go to the Caucasus and the other to Volgograd. They thought would that Army A and B. And that's where the Soviet forces ultimately met them, was at Stalingrad. And that's considered
interrupt real quick. Did you know anything about the force that went to the Caucasus? Did they get a lot of resistance there?
Well, they were sending the force to Stalingrad, largely just I believe just because they thought it would hold off the Soviet advance from the oil fields, but they wanted to destroy their army.
But you said that they sent like troops to the Caucasus.
Well, yeah, there were the oil fields, and then there were Stalingrad. Stalingrad is relatively close to the Caucasus.
Okay.
Yeah, but the oil fields of Baku is where they were going. And they sent one of their groups to Stalingrad. And Stalingrad was of some strategic importance because it was on the river, and obviously they could, get supplies down there if they took it.
Was there any fighting in Baku?
I'm not. Well, I'll talk about Stalingrad first.
Okay.
So Stalingrad, it's known as, by most estimates, is the bloodiest battle in human history. I mean, this is probably a single battle, I should say. So basically, it's defined by basically just brutal street fighting. Basically, just complete annihilation. Obviously, the civilian population was completely decimated. So ultimately, it was kind of like one of those battles where it could have gone either way. No side had one of the clear kind of advantage, but ultimately, just kind of like the Soviets did end up performing encirclement around the city, and also the Germans were losing a lot of morale, because obviously the Soviets were more morale to fight because this was their home turf, where it wasn't from with the Germans. But ultimately, and of course the winter, was coming on. Basically, like and that kind of like destroyed them also. But ultimately,
the winter was bad for the Germans because they weren't used to fighting in such stark coldness. I knew an anecdote where a German soldier went to fight, was at Stalingrad. He was in a building and he looked out and he saw the Russian soldiers bathing in like the ice cold river, like they were just taking a bath and laughing. And he was like, "Oh shit, we're not gonna win this battle if I'm like freezing in a building, and the Russians are literally just laughing in a river, So it's like the Germans were not prepared for that kind of cold."
And after that, of course, it was basically all downhill from there for the Germans. They had to retreat. Like there was some fighting left in Russia after that, but ultimately, very quickly, they kind of had to retreat, and because the Allies were invading in Normandy, and they only had just one front.
I heard that it was someone in Napoleon who, although Napoleon actually destroyed Moscow, or burned it at least, but it was like a Pyrrhic victory for him. It really wasn't worth all it took him to do. But in this case, they just lost. The Russians did lose a lot of troops for sure, but very bloody battle.
Yeah, but more civilians.
Yeah, I mean, they lost more in this battle than a lot of countries lost in the war. And
Oh yeah.
well, one anecdote. I don't know if you know about this, but apparently there was a captain, an army captain in the Soviet army, who literally had like a rocket launcher of some kind, and he led like a battalion in a building where they would just shoot rocket launchers from that building at tanks. And during the whole battle, the tanks would try to take out this small building, and literally they couldn't kill. They never killed the guy with the rocket launcher, and he just took out like 40 tanks with just one rocket launcher at Stalingrad.
Well, yeah, and
Have you heard of this?
there was a lot of attrition done by snipers from the Soviets to the German troops that would harass them kind of in that way. A lot of them were actually women who were snipers that they were deployed. But yeah, so after that, I mean, obviously with the aid of America joining in 1942 after Pearl Harbor, even though it wasn't the Germans who attacked them, they did send a theater to Europe. So they were formulating the invasion of Normandy with America, Britain, and de Gaulle. I mean, he kind of played a role too. I mean, even though he wasn't a lot mainly involved, he was mostly the only area he controlled was Algeria by that time, like kind of that department. But ultimately, they would he ultimately did gain a seat actually in the major conferences like Yalta and all these other things, even though he wasn't actually commanding like a lot of troops on the ground, just because politically it would be important to have the French. But with Normandy, ultimately we all know like of the guns on Normandy Beach or Omaha Beach, basically. But all of that was a holding action. The Germans knew they wouldn't be able to stop the Allies at the beach. They just decided to hold them off as much as possible, and they were getting troops rapidly out of Russia, basically, to come back to the home front because they needed to defend it. And Russia, of course, advanced through a lot of these areas. They were hardly less brutal than the Germans were in their march into the areas as the Russians were on their march through the areas the Germans had conquered. They also engaged in a ton of atrocities against the population, especially with sexual assault. Like you talk about mass rape of German women and stuff like that, and that happened a lot of times during their march from the east into Germany. So the major bombing campaigns, of course, were the Rhineland, which is the major industrial region, Hamburg and Dresden, which, as you mentioned earlier. But with the bombing campaigns, so the Rhineland, that was obvious why they did. They both wanted to clear the way for the Allies' advance, and it was the major industrial regions. They wanted to destroy their industrial capacity. But with Dresden and Hamburg, that's more controversial because, first of all, Dresden is mostly a cultural city. It's not really an industrial city, and it's far away. It's on like the far eastern side of Germany, not where the Allies were advancing from, at least with respect to the United States and Britain, which engaged in the bombing. But so they actually killed a ton of German citizens, like those bombings. I mean, it was comparable to the bombings in Japan, kind of, basically, like you said.
Yeah, and keep in mind that the firebombing of Tokyo in Japan was more devastating than the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, like, if even in Tokyo, the fucking fire bombings are worse than the nuclear bombs. You can imagine what it was like for the Germans when several of their cities were being destroyed by bomber planes. It's really a travesty.
And and with Hitler, they're actually Germans. A lot of them knew that he was going to lead them to ruin, and they wanted to sue for peace. So there's actually a plot called the Valkyrie plot to assassinate him by some German army officers. They planned to explode a bomb under his table. Actually, did end up doing it, but it didn't actually end up killing Hitler.
Yeah, and
that's
what's
kind of like a
interesting
lot of the
about
lines.
that?
A lot of people who knew Hitler personally, that say that was one of the lines where he kind of lost a lot of his sanity because he was known to be kind of like very unhinged at the end. That whole downfall parody videos, that actually was a real event that happened. Him, going crazy on the generals in the war room.
Good movie too. It's a good movie if you ever watch it. The thing that really a lot of Hitler obviously was a competent leader, but he had several pitfalls, and he in a position like where he was basically pushed to insanity because he was paranoid because a lot of his fellow his most competent, I don't know, co-leaders or his generals and cabinet members, the people that they were betraying him, because anyone with like any sense of morality was basically betraying Hitler. And so he was just surrounded. He was no longer surrounded by competent people mixed in with evil. Now he was surrounded by sycophants who were basically malicious. And so the Rudolf Hess was the deputy of the Nazi Party. He was his assistant, and then early in the war, he fled. He went to Scotland to quote unquote have treaties with the Duke of Kent, who he thought would like help end the war or something. But as soon as he got off the plane in Scotland, he was ambushed and arrested. And he was arrested until like the 80s or 70s, and then he killed himself in prison. Another person was Franz Halder, was the German leader of the German High Command. He was the highest military official, but he was implicated in a plot to kill Hitler, not the Valkyrie operation, but one earlier. And once Hitler found out about that, he removed him from his post and put him in prison. And I think he spent his days in the Spandau prison, or that I think and he was the only prisoner there. But he was out of the picture, even though he was this magisterially important figure. And then also Rommel was the best sort of general, one of the very best. He was implicated in the Valkyrie plot. And so in order for him to keep his life, he was ordered to commit suicide, or else Hitler would kill his family. So a lot of the most competent people in the German leadership became irrelevant or died or whatever. And so Hitler didn't really have like any reliable friends. He just was surrounded, like you said, by sycophants. Now, the other thing that was a detriment was that Hitler had syphilis, and his doctors didn't really know what to do with him. So they just gave him a bunch of methamphetamine and weird drugs. And a lot of the guys around Hitler in this coterie, they were also on like weird drugs just so they could stay afloat with all the stress of running the Nazi Germany. And so those are the two things. And then the third thing was that a lot of Hitler's like ideas were probably morally destitute and probably fucked with his conscience. Like he would build rockets when the Luftwaffe started falling apart. He would force people to build rockets just to launch them into Britain, as a fucking supervillain kind of things. And that's why the rocketry as a science advanced so much during this period, was because he was obsessed with having rockets because he couldn't use planes anymore. And on top of that, there's all the medical experimentation that he was improving on the poor people that were put in the camps, and like left and right, he was like authorizing all these fucked up things, and that was probably draining his fucking moral conscience. So those are the three things I think led to the downfall of Hitler.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, I think any reasonable person can agree that morally the Nazis were completely repugnant, but in terms of the just objective advances they did make in a lot of sciences, they actually did sciences and infrastructure. They actually did quite a bit. Like,
have you heard of Operation Paperclip?
A lot of the first developments of what would become the nuclear bomb were originally by German scientists, and they think the Manhattan Project actually got a lot from leaking them, and they made it so they could eventually get the bomb, along with Einstein and a bunch of other people who were developing that. But
have you heard of Operation Paperclip?
Well, I was going to get to like kind of like the Battle of the Bulge. So that was kind of one.
Before you do that, let's say the Operation Paperclip was at the end of the war. They got these scientists. They were recruited by the American and respective allied governments to work for them. And Werner von Braun had a factory where he'd hang Jews, who were the slowest workers. And but then he was recruited by NASA to lead NASA in the space program. So like, and the same thing. So like they totally like washed away all the blood that these people were embroiled in. And also like, not just the scientists. I mean, obviously you have Albert Einstein and others who were actually Jewish, and they didn't, or, Niels Bohr, someone who wasn't Nazi, but they did have Nazi scientists. It was really bizarre. And then the other thing was that there's this myth of the clean Wehrmacht that the Franz Halder helped perpetrate, which was perpetuate. I mean, which was the idea that like, oh yeah, the government was corrupt, but the army was like this pure entity that was just pragmatically operating. The reality was that the Wehrmacht did a lot, and that's, by the way, that's just the German army. They did a lot of fucked up things to the civilians on their side and on the opponent's side. And it hasn't even been really fully like figured out. We don't really know like all the fucked up things that have happened because of the German army in this period. Now, and then that's why we should talk. That's what brings it to the Battle of the Bulge, which is,
That was a
to
counter.
me, is the chief and pivotal event in the war, is the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, that was kind of like, there's some disagreement on historians as to whether it was just a holding action or they thought it could actually revitalize the German offensive. I mean, if Hitler thought it could revitalize the German offensive, he was obviously, that would just confirm his insanity. But it did end up, kind of delay the Allies' advance because it caught them off guard. Like basically, it was a counteroffensive in the areas of, I think it was somewhere around like Western Germany area. But so basically the Battle of the Bulge, I mean, it is kind of overlooked a lot in terms of like World War II battles, but it was important to know about the end of the war, at least on the Western Front. It was in the Ardennes, the forest, basically. So between Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany.
Keep in mind, before this, Hitler ordered the destruction of Paris because he was very aware that the Allies would take it over, and because the Allies were moving eastward quickly, and the general who was in charge of managing Paris hung up the phone and then just thought about it for a long time, and he just refused. He was like, "I'm not going to let this tyrant destroy the most beautiful city in Europe." And so, but Hitler literally ordered it to be destroyed.
Well, yeah. I mean, Hitler was obviously, like I say, was delusional at that point. But so, I mean, of course, if you think the advance of the Western powers was bad with all the bombing and stuff like that, I mean, what the Russians did, I mean, the Germans were like, there were Germans who were basically like fleeing west to avoid the Russians. They knew it was coming. Basically, like I said, there was mass rape of German women, just like really brutality. And there was obviously an understandable reason because the Germans had been so brutal to the Russian and Eastern European population. They thought of it as like just revenge, basically, and humiliation for the Germans for what they did. But the Russians would ultimately be the one who took Berlin. But to
be fair, Evan, the rapes were atrocious, but they probably weren't at the scale, or maybe even not as, maybe they were still as horrific, but they weren't at the scale of the rape of Nanking in China.
Oh no, certainly. I mean, the Japanese, that's a whole other issue. But with Germany, basically, you always talk about Hitler in his bunker, and of course that was what everyone considered, for all intents and purposes, the end of the war. There was a successor to Hitler. I don't remember what exactly his name is. But he was there for like 7 days, Karl Donitz, and basically until he officially, the Germans surrender. He was ultimately convicted at Nuremberg, but he was only sentenced to 10 years because basically they wanted to at least somewhat, like they knew they couldn't do it because he was the one who ordered the surrender, even though they had to convict him technically. So basically, like when a lot of the other, so basically the war ended then with Nazi Germany's surrender. And after the war, they had the Nuremberg trials.
Whoa!
Yeah.
Don't, you're getting really far ahead. You have to remember the Battle of the Bulge was, there was a line where the Germans were pushing through, and Patton was like, "Okay, we're not going to let them push through," and that was this bulge, right? And so that the Germans were pushing through on this offensive line, and so they fought in the winter to like stiff resistance, where they were basically in trenches that the soldiers had to dig themselves, and day and night they had to. It was almost like World War I level, like of fighting at this point, where they had to always be aware of what was going on outside the trench or the fox. They weren't trenches really; they were foxholes, but they were similar to trenches. because in a trench, it's a long line where you can have carriers bring provisions and ordnance, munition, letters and whatnot, correspondence. But in the foxhole, just soldiers are the only ones in underground, whereas the actual like the medics and the people delivering things are actually above ground. Now, but eventually they had a very long winter at a place called Bastogne, and this sort of precipitated the victory at the Battle of the Bulge. And then the Americans started pushing eastward even more, and Hitler obviously got killed himself. He shot himself with a Walther P-38. I actually saw the spot where he killed himself when I visited Berlin about 10 years ago. And now it's just like in a parking lot, there's no marking or anything. It's really funny.
There's a lot of conspiracy theories about that because, of course, there's never a picture of the body shown. There's obviously he's not living today, but some people say, oh, he secretly escaped and lived or went to Argentina. A lot of the Nazi leaders actually did go to Argentina, like Mengele and Eichmann did.
Eichmann, yeah, very famously.
Eichmann was later captured by Israel.
And Eichmann organized a lot of the
he was doing the logistics of a lot of the
death camps. He organized. So Eichmann was like the top of the pyramid of the Nazi war criminals. And but anyway, so I digress. When Berlin was being taken, Hitler ordered something called Operation Nordwind, which was the last offensive the Germans ever did on the Western Front. And essentially, it was a last-ditch effort to just kill as many Americans and British as he could. And he tried soldiers, right? And so he literally dispatches his orders, and he says, there is no objective here. This isn't about glory. You're just going to kill as many people as you can. It's always, and so of course that fails because the spirit of it was preposterous. But yeah, the Germans lost. They decidedly lost. And with Hitler dead, there was no option but to round up all the Nazis who were subordinate to him and figure out what their punishment might be.
Like Goebbels committed suicide, I believe.
Goebbels killed his entire family.
Yeah.
Do you know that?
Yeah, but
he poisoned his daughters.
Yeah, I think. But with the Nuremberg trials, a lot of people criticized it during the time because they saw it was victor's justice. All the prosecutors and all the judges were represented by the 4 allied countries of Britain, United States, Soviet Union, and France. I mean, France was.
You're talking about the Yalta Conference, or are you talking about Nuremberg?
No, I'm talking about I'll get to talk about the Yalta Conference. That's when they agreed to divide up Germany into multiple spheres of influence. They said it would basically be each country would occupy like a certain area, and obviously the areas east of the demarcation line would all become Soviet, client states, part of the Warsaw Pact later. But
what was weird about Nuremberg, right, was that so many of them, I gave them IQ tests for some reason. And so many of these guys had like really high IQs. And not only did they have high IQs, a lot of them they're asked, do you regret what you've done or what you participated in or whatever? And they were like, no, we didn't regret it at all. Most of them had no remorse. There was a couple people that did. I forget who exactly, and then I think Albert Speer was one of them, and he actually had a lighter sentence. And Albert Speer, if you don't know, was the architect that designed all the buildings that Hitler wanted to create in his religious pomposity, basically Nazi iconographic buildings that promoted himself. But they were kind of cool. They were based off Egyptian architecture and stuff, so pretty good designs, but just like really arrogant and self-absorbed. But Albert Speer was this architect who admitted that the Nazis were fucked up, but he was the only one who really admitted showed remorse, right? But then when there's speculation actually that he only did that so that he would get a lighter sentence. And people, before he died in like the 80s or 90s, people would always interview him and be like, did you do fucked up things? Like, were you part of anything? Were you a true Nazi? He's like, oh no, like I was never a true Nazi. I was forced to do it by Hitler. But he actually, there's a lot of speculation that he was just lying because he didn't want to get punished,
Okay, so with the Nuremberg trials, a few of them, like Göring, actually committed suicide before they were executed after being sentenced to death. I mean,
Göring was in prison. Yeah. No, Göring hung himself in prison But then
Yeah.
Goebbels killed himself before he was even arrested.
Well,
But
yeah.
yeah. Here, I want to look up this. I don't know much about it, so I literally want to type it up and say what we can find because it's so fascinating. Do you know what the Nuremberg Code is?
That's like the idea of what a lot of it comes of international law. I mean, there was the UN and the International Criminal Court weren't really established then, so it was just the victors. A lot of people criticize it as victors' justice because of that. All the judges, but
so Martin Bormann killed himself, and he was the successor to Rudolf Hess as the Nazi Party. He was Hitler's aide de camp. He was his assistant. He committed suicide, and then Rudolf Hess was in prison, Spandau prison, until 1987, where he committed suicide. Imagine that being in prison for like 50 years, and then just killing yourself or something. Ribbentrop was hanged. He was an ambassador to the United Kingdom, and he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He actually did express repentance, but he was hanged.
Yeah.
Let me know. Well, sorry. I don't, not too much dead air. I just want to.
So yeah, Germany was split into multiple occupation zones. Obviously, there was a huge effort to scrub anything related to the Nazis from their entire, thing. I mean, they couldn't, with the Nuremberg trials, they couldn't try everyone who was involved in atrocities because obviously there would be very, they'd have to kill a lot of people if that were true. But so they just kind of,
what's funny, man?
Symbolic thing.
You know what is funny is that Karl Donitz was the leader of the Kriegsmarine, which is the Navy, and he was actually not executed. It's kind of funny. You'd think that someone leading a branch of the military would be executed, but he wasn't.
And so obviously in 1945, that's when the UN is officially established. It wasn't as powerful then as it was now, but I mean, they kind of saw it as a successor to the League of Nations, and it definitely was more successful and long lasting than the League of Nations was. So then you see the Iron Curtain when the Soviets take over their areas. You have the Marshall Plan, obviously the United States trying to rebuild Western Europe by basically giving them huge grants. A lot of that was basically to keep them from falling under more communist influence, and they actually tried to do it in the Soviet bloc, but they were refused by the authorities that the Soviets set up. Basically, they so some countries were officially part of the Soviet Union, like the Balkans and not the Baltics and Ukraine. Some were Soviet client states, which were basically supposedly independent states, but really in reality puppet states. And others were in the Balkans were held by a man named Tito, who led the resistance against what the Nazi-aligned Ustas were under the Croatians, and he unified Yugoslavia under that. But he was a communist. But the thing is, he was not a Stalinist, and Stalin, of course, didn't want any sort of communists who were not loyal to him. So he tried to have him assassinated multiple times, and Tito got so upset with that. He sent a letter to Moscow and he said, "Stop sending assassins here or I'll send one to Moscow," basically threatening him, and said, "We're going to retain our independence from the Kremlin."
And just to digress a little bit, they had the Nuremberg race laws were created by a guy called Wilhelm Frick, and Wilhelm Frick was hanged in October 16th, 1946 at the Nuremberg trials. So he writes these things called these anti-Semitic laws called the Nuremberg race laws, and then he ends up getting hanged in the Nuremberg trials. It's like just ultimate irony. What else did you want to mention before we close out the podcast?
Okay, I have a few more things to mention. So obviously there was the creation of Israel after this. What happened though is the British, that was their mandate of Palestine. And so basically it come to a point where basically both what the Palestinian Arabs and the Jewish Zionists wanted them gone. Obviously no one wanted the British there. So they eventually just abandoned it and left it to the UN, which came up with the partition plan.
And Syria became a country as well, right?
Syria and Jordan. Jordan was originally part of the mandate of Palestine, but it became separate. And obviously this isn't a history of Israel Palestine, but just after that, the Holocaust, that's where a lot of them moved to, because that wasn't really practical to move there or the United States. But there were also expulsions of a ton of ethnic Germans from areas within Eastern Europe, like Poland, the Czech Republic. And a lot of these were not people who were moved in by the Nazis. They were ethnic Germans who lived there for, centuries, but their families were expelled because obviously there was a ton of anger at the Nazis and they took it out on them. It would basically be recently described as an ethnic cleansing in today's terms. There are also a lot of displaced people in my family, on my dad's side being one of them, who ultimately, like some of the Russians were actually forcibly repatriated to the Soviet Union, where many were actually executed or put to long terms of imprisonment because they were aiding the Germans. Even though it was forced labor, the Stalinist government didn't really care. They saw it as basically anyone who aided the Germans was a traitor, no matter what.
Including the Pope? Come on.
It's like, no. People.
No, but it's just funny. It's just, yeah, it's like.
Yeah. But basically, there were a lot of displaced people, like entire ethnic groups often displaced, but that Romani, who were actually another group who were colloquially called gypsies, were actually killed at a rate higher than the Jews were. But
I can believe that, but there's less gypsies, so you don't hear about it as much. But yeah,
Poland probably had the highest proportion of their population killed. Like there was just like a complete bloodbath after.
Do you know? Yeah, really, they had that many gypsies in Poland. Romani.
No. I'm talking about gypsies in Europe. No, in Poland, and just in general, the country's population was like they suffered huge losses. And to think that after that, they had to look forward to another
they were annihilated.
40 years of dictatorship. After that, they're not going to have a good time, And then, so France obviously regained its independence. Well, de Gaulle.
A lot of Polish cities were also bombed too. It's really bad time for Poland.
Basically, Pétain was sentenced to. He was sentenced to life. He was like in his 90s then, but he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Basically, like they said, like I said, the only reason they didn't execute it was because of World War I. So his legacy was forever destroyed by that. So Britain probably came up the least damaged after that. And there was actually a weird transition at the end of, in 1945, which was Winston Churchill was by all accounts considered like a national hero in Britain. Like he was revered. But actually in 1945, the Labour Party, which was the opposition party, like the kind of left opposition party, actually won the election by pretty solid margin. And their Prime Minister Clement Attlee came into power. A lot of people were perplexed and saying Churchill was a national hero. Why would he be voted out? And the reason was what Britain did to create a lot of people motivated to keep the war on was they said, we're going to adopt a lot of welfare programs and basically like stuff that will benefit the population after the war is done. And that's why you need to keep fighting. And they thought the conservatives would be less likely to actually implement those promises. So they voted the Labour Party in. And the Labour Party had a prime minister before them, but they never had a prime minister that was actually elected with his party as a majority. They had a man named Ramsay MacDonald who was he was appointed once by the Conservatives who were in the majority. They did it to appease, because there was a wave of strikes in the United Kingdom, and they did that to appease the labor unions who were organizing the strikes. They said, hey, we'll appoint one of the Labour Party people as the prime minister. But ultimately, he was just considered a puppet of the Conservatives. Clement Attlee was one of the first kind of true, independently Labour prime ministers. Obviously, de Gaulle, we'll get to him in France.
Well, let me say something about France. So yeah, and obviously this is very interesting what you're saying about Britain. But it's with Churchill, and obviously the counterpart to Churchill in France is Charles de Gaulle. And like Churchill, he was elected as the prime minister of France. And he eventually, and this reestablished France as a republic, because they had been that had been compromised, and it was the French Fourth Republic. But like Churchill, sort of like the failing of like Churchill's continued, he wasn't elected. I guess it's not really a failing, but he just wasn't elected again. But with de Gaulle, they actually had to recreate the republic. So after the Nazis left, they called it the Fourth Republic, and then after de Gaulle left, they ended up turning into the Fifth Republic. And the reason was is they had all these colonial possessions that were deemed unethical to even have, namely in West Africa, Algeria, and they had a war. So they ended up having this war in Algeria.
Well, that's kind of, yeah.
And that's that's very later on, but it's just funny because it's similar to the British thing where it's like it's a little too conservative after the war, so they had to actually revamp it. They
also had to give independence to India, and they have famously partitioned it into India and Pakistan for the Muslim and Hindu population.
Pakistan and also Bangladesh.
Yeah, and Bangladesh was considered West Pakistan then, because they made Pakistan big to the Muslim areas, and it didn't draw the lines totally. So there was actually a huge population influx, both fleeing west and east of Muslims and Hindus, and a lot of that had huge violence. It was a disastrous partition by all accounts, but it created the modern states as we know it. I mean, so de Gaulle was considered, he's even to this day considered like a national hero. There's even a political ideology that a lot of people called Gaullism, basically a form of French nationalism that's still kind of prominent today in France. That's how influential he was.
Well, what a lot of people don't know about de Gaulle was that he wasn't a super important war combatant, like leader.
Yeah, no, he was a moral leader.
He was a moral leader, but he wasn't like a war fighter. He ended that he was. That's why he's more like Churchill than he is like Eisenhower or Patton or someone, or Bernard Montgomery, who was the general that led the coalition of the Allies. But he was British. But de Gaulle was a general, but he wasn't really like regarded as much. He was as a general. He became more of a politician.
Okay, I'll get one more event. I'll talk about the Greek Civil War. So obviously, Greece was not part of the Balkans that was united, and Yugoslavia united under Tito. So a lot of the Greek, the Civil War was fought between communist partisans who were actually much more aligned with Tito than Stalin. That's one of the reasons Stalin didn't give them as much support, and because he still wanted to be on good terms with the British and French that early on. The Cold War hadn't really developed a ton of its tensions by that point. So they did have a civil war in Greece between the Greek government that was supported by the Western powers, kind of seen as an anti-communist bulwark, and the communist partisans. And ultimately, it was a pretty violent war. There's a lot of atrocities on but ultimately, it wasn't that huge of a war in terms of like casualties. And ultimately, the Hellenic, the so-called Hellenic Republic did win, but they beat back the communists, and that was a lot of the impetus behind the formation of NATO. When we get to before the alliances that would keep against Soviet expansion. But
so I'm confused. They were going to be part of the USSR, and then they resisted.
What? Who?
The Greeks?
No, the Greeks were an independent country. There was fighting between them that escalated after World War II between communist partisans supported by Tito in Yugoslavia.
So it was like Korea or something.
Yeah, okay.
Basically.
But so ultimately, it was kind of considered one of the first kind of proxy wars of the Cold War, even though the Soviet Union wasn't as involved as it would have been, other than because Tito was the main one supporting them, and they didn't like him. But ultimately, that was kind of one of the first things that would start the tensions of the Cold War. I think we'll get into the Cold War in the next one. So this was from 1939 to 1948. We'll definitely have a long one in the next one. But until then, I think that should wrap it up. This was a pretty big one to do, but.
Yeah, how long was this? Over an hour for sure. All right.
Yeah.
Good to hear from you, Evan. We'll do it later.
Sure.